At Christmas dinner, I set the table for my son Jason and his family. Every plate perfect, every candle lit, thinking this would be the night we finally felt like a family again. But when dinner ended, I saw them gathering for a photo and no one called my name. I stood right there watching my own son step closer to his wife Emily as she adjusted everyone's positions like I didn't exist. The camera flashed once, twice, and I realized I had been erased from my own family memory. Jason posted the photo minutes later with the caption, "Perfect Christmas with family," and I wasn't in it. Not even a shadow. And as I stared at the screen, I noticed Emily looking back at me without speaking. Then Jason said quietly, "Mom, it was just a quick shot." But I already knew this wasn't a mistake. I heard the words before I even understood what they meant. "We're just doing a quick photo, Mom. You don't need to be in this one." My son Jason said casually, as if he was talking about an extra chair at the table. Not about me. Not about the woman who had spent the entire day cooking Christmas dinner from scratch in my small Ohio home. I stood there holding a serving spoon still warm from the mashed potatoes, watching my family slowly shift together in front of the fireplace, smiling, adjusting, laughing softly, while I remained just outside the frame like I had accidentally walked into someone else's memory. Emily, my daughter-in-law, carefully moved her hand on Jason's arm and tilted her head as if arranging a picture in a magazine. "Perfect, like this," she said gently, and no one questioned her. No one looked back at me, not even Jason, and I remember thinking maybe they just forgot. Maybe it was a simple oversight. But then I noticed how quickly they had all aligned without hesitation, like the space where I stood had already been decided for me. I set the spoon down slowly on the counter, the sound barely noticeable over the soft holiday music playing in the background. And I watched as the camera lifted, as the countdown began, as I realized I was not part of the moment I had created with my own hands. The flash went off once, then again, and I stayed exactly where I was, invisible in my own living room. Jason checked the photo immediately, smiling at his phone. "That one's good," he said, and then he turned away from me again as if nothing was missing, as if everything was complete. I walked slowly to the kitchen doorway, my footsteps quiet against the wooden floor, and that's when I saw it on his screen. The image already uploaded, already being liked, already being shared. My family standing together in front of my Christmas tree, and me nowhere in sight. Not even a reflection. I didn't speak. I didn't interrupt. I just watched as Emily leaned closer to Jason and said softly, "It looks perfect," and Jason nodded like he agreed with something I could no longer understand. Later that night, as they left the house one by one, laughing softly about dinner and travel plans, I stood alone in the dim glow of the living room lights, staring at the empty space where I had been replaced in the picture, and I realized something I had never allowed myself to see before. It wasn't just a photo I was missing from, it was my place in their life, and what I did next would make them understand that silence is not the same as acceptance. I stood there long after the front door closed, listening to the last echoes of their footsteps fade into the cold December night, and for a moment I did not move at all, not because I could not, but because I needed to understand how silence in a house that used to feel full of life could suddenly feel like something had been taken away piece by piece until nothing recognizable remained. The Christmas lights I had carefully hung earlier that day still blinked softly across the living room, casting warm colors on walls that now felt distant and unfamiliar. I walked slowly toward the dining table where plates were still half full, untouched in the rush of departure, and I began clearing them one by one without thinking, my hands steady in a way my heart was not, because something inside me had shifted and I could feel it settling into a place I had never allowed it to exist before. I thought about Jason as a child, the way he used to run into my arms every time he came home from school, the way he would insist on helping me set the table even when he was too small to carry the plates properly. I remembered Emily when she first joined our family, how polite she was, how she smiled at everything I said as if she was learning the rhythm of our home. And I wondered when exactly I had become someone who stood outside of it. I sat down at the edge of the sofa later that night, still in the dim glow of the Christmas tree, and I opened my phone, almost without intention, only to see the photograph again, already shared across multiple family threads, already collecting comments filled with hearts and compliments, everyone praising how beautiful and complete the image looked, and I noticed something I had not fully allowed myself to see earlier. How naturally the composition worked without me, how easily the story of that picture continued without interruption, as if I had never been part of it to begin with. The next morning came quietly, gray light slipping through the curtains, and I moved through the house with slow, measured steps, making coffee I did not really want, sitting at the same kitchen table where I had spent decades planning meals, holidays, birthdays, and ordinary Tuesdays that no one ever remembers until they are gone. I kept thinking about the word forgotten and how it is often used gently, as if it excuses everything, as if absence is always accidental, but what I felt was not forgetfulness, it was structure, it was intention hidden behind politeness, and I began noticing things I had ignored before, small patterns I had once dismissed as coincidence, like how conversations would pause slightly when I entered the room, or how plans would already be decided before I was asked. Or how Emily always seemed to know exactly where she wanted everyone to stand, even in photographs. Later that day, Jason called me, his voice light, casual, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. He asked if I had enjoyed the evening, if everything had gone well, and I found myself answering carefully, choosing words that did not reveal too much of what I was thinking, because I was not ready yet to let him hear the change forming in my voice. I said yes, it was lovely, and he seemed satisfied with that answer, quickly moving on to talk about travel plans for the new year, about places he and Emily were considering visiting, about schedules that did not include asking whether I might want to join. And I listened quietly, realizing how easily I had been trained to accept the role of observer in my own family's life. After the call ended, I sat for a long time without moving, the phone still in my hand, and I thought about all the moments I had once believed were simply part of family life, the times I was not invited, the decisions made without me, the conversations that continued smoothly in my absence, and I began to see a pattern forming with uncomfortable clarity. That what had happened on Christmas was not an isolated moment, but a final confirmation of something that had been developing slowly over time. I walked to the living room again and stood in front of the photograph displayed on the television screen. Enlarged automatically by the device, my family smiling in perfect alignment, and I studied each face carefully. Jason's relaxed confidence, Emily's quiet control, the ease in which they occupied the center of the frame. And I realized that none of them looked uncomfortable without me there. None of them seemed to be searching for what was missing, and that realization landed more quietly than pain. It landed like understanding. The kind that does not need to be spoken to change everything. I went back to the kitchen and placed my hands on the table, feeling the cool surface beneath my palms, and I told myself something simple, something I had not allowed myself to consider before, that being invisible to them did not mean I had to remain invisible to myself. And in that moment I understood that the next step I took would not be about asking to be seen again. It would be about deciding what I would do now that I finally saw everything clearly. I did not sleep much that night, not because of sadness in the way people usually imagine it, but because my mind would not stop replaying the same image over and over again, the photograph on the screen, the way everyone had naturally leaned into each other as if the shape of their family had already been decided long before I ever entered the room, and by the time morning light finally spread across my kitchen floor, I was no longer asking myself if I had been forgotten. I was asking myself how many times I had been quietly removed without noticing. I made coffee I did not drink. I sat by the window watching neighbors clear snow from their driveways after a light overnight frost. And I realized how ordinary everything looked outside my home compared to how unsettled everything felt inside it. Later that morning, I decided to clean the living room again, even though it was already clean, because movement felt easier than thinking. And while I was folding a blanket on the sofa, I heard my phone buzz repeatedly from the kitchen counter. I walked over and saw messages from Jason, short and casual, talking about how Emily was planning a small New Year dinner, nothing large, just immediate family. The words immediate family lingered in my mind longer than I expected. because I noticed again what I was not being asked, not being invited, not being considered. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I opened the family messaging thread that I had been part of for years, or at least I thought I was part of. And what I saw made something inside me go still in a way I had not felt before. There were messages discussing seating arrangements, timing, even what store to order dessert from, and my name did not appear once, not even in passing, not even in a suggestion. It was as if I existed outside the structure of their planning entirely, and what struck me most was not anger, but the clarity of it, the smooth efficiency of decisions being made without resistance. As if my absence had already been accounted for in advance, I scrolled further back, and I began noticing older conversations I had never paid attention to, mentions of holidays where I now realized I had been invited late or indirectly, messages where plans changed without explanation, apologies that did not feel like apologies anymore when read in sequence. I put the phone down for a moment and looked around my kitchen, at the calendar on the wall where I still marked birthdays and appointments in neat handwriting, and I understood suddenly how two versions of the same family could exist in parallel, one where I was central, and one where I was optional, or perhaps no longer included at all. That afternoon Jason called again. And this time I let the phone ring longer before answering. His voice was cheerful, slightly rushed, talking about New Year reservations, about how busy everything had become, and he mentioned Emily was handling most of the coordination because she was better at organizing large groups. I listened carefully to the phrasing, the way responsibility had quietly shifted, the way authority had become routine. And I asked him gently if there was a reason I was not included in the planning conversation. There was a brief pause on the other end, the kind of pause that carries more information than words, and then he laughed lightly and said of course I was included. It was just assumed I would come if I wanted to, no need to ask directly, and in that moment I understood something important, that exclusion does not always arrive as a rejection. Sometimes it arrives as assumption, as silence that pretends to be consideration. After the call ended, I walked through the house again, slower this time, noticing things I had not noticed before, like how often I had been the one initiating gatherings, how often I had been the one confirming details, how often I had filled in gaps that others never felt responsible for filling. I stopped in front of the Christmas tree still standing in the corner of the living room, its lights now slightly dimmer in daylight, and I thought about how carefully I had prepared that evening, not just the food, but the feeling. The effort to create warmth that others seemed to step into so naturally without acknowledging who built it, and I began to see a pattern not just of absence, but of dependence, because I had always been the one holding things together quietly, without asking for recognition, and in doing so, I had trained everyone around me to believe that my presence was automatic, like furniture in a room, always there, never questioned. That evening I decided to go through old photos on my phone, not the recent ones, but the older albums from previous years, and what I found surprised me not because of what was there, but because of what I had missed while living through it. I saw group pictures where I stood at the edge more often than the center. I saw events where I appeared only in background reflections or partial frames. I saw moments where I had clearly been present physically but not fully included socially, and I realized I had mistaken presence for belonging. I placed the phone down and sat in silence for a long time, listening to the faint sound of the heating system cycling through the house, and I thought about Emily, not with anger, but with a growing sense of understanding that made me uneasy. Because I could now see how decisions could be made gently, without conflict, without visible cruelty, yet still produce the same result of removal. And I wondered when exactly Jason had stopped noticing the difference between including someone and simply allowing them to remain nearby. Later that night, I received another message, this time from Emily, polite, brief, asking if I preferred early or late dinner for New Year's Eve, and for a moment I stared at the screen without responding. Because the question itself felt like a test I had not agreed to take, not because of the time of dinner, but because of what it implied, that my attendance was still conditional, still negotiable, still outside the center of decision-making. I put the phone face down on the table and leaned back in my chair, and for the first time I did not feel confused about my place in their world. I felt something else, something quieter and more precise, a kind of recognition that changes the shape of everything that comes after it. And as the house settled into its nighttime stillness, I understood that the next time I stood in a room with them, I would no longer be trying to find where I belonged. I would be watching to see whether they still remembered I was there at. I woke up the next morning with a strange sense of calm that did not feel like peace, but like the quiet after a long internal argument finally ends, and for the first time in days I did not reach for my phone immediately. I simply sat at the edge of my bed and listened to the house around me, the faint hum of heating, the distant sound of a neighbor's car starting outside, ordinary life continuing as if nothing in mine had shifted, but everything in me had. I made breakfast out of habit, toast and coffee, yet I barely tasted either, because my mind kept returning to the same realization that had been forming slowly over the past days, that I was no longer being pushed away in obvious ways, but being repositioned quietly, gently, as if someone had decided my place in the story without informing me. Later that morning, I received a message from Jason confirming New Year's Eve dinner at Emily's sister's house. A smaller gathering, he wrote. Just close family. And again the phrase close family landed with a weight that felt different than before, because I was beginning to understand how language could be used to include and exclude at the same time without ever sounding unkind. I replied simply that I would think about it, which was not my usual response, because I had spent most of my life answering quickly, agreeing easily, adjusting myself around the needs of others, but something in me now resisted automatic participation. I spent the rest of the morning going through old storage boxes in my closet, not because I needed anything, but because I needed to see my own history outside of memory, photographs, greeting cards, school projects Jason had made as a child, all carefully preserved by me over decades, and I noticed something unsettling as I looked through them. I was always the one holding the camera, or standing slightly behind others, or leaning in from the edge of a frame. I had been present in their lives in a way that was consistent but never central, and I wondered when that had become acceptable without me ever noticing. In the afternoon, Emily called me directly, her voice polite in the way it always was, carefully measured, asking if I had decided about New Year's Eve. She explained seating arrangements, time expectations, even who would bring what dish, and I listened to her speak as if she was organizing a business meeting rather than a family gathering, and when she paused, I told her calmly that I was still deciding. There was a brief silence on the line that lasted just long enough to feel intentional, and then she said, "Of course, take your time. We just want everyone to feel comfortable." And that word comfortable stayed with me after the call ended, because I began to understand that comfort for some people often depends on the quiet adjustment of others. That evening, Jason came by briefly to drop off something for the holiday, a small wrapped gift he said I could open later, and he stayed only a few minutes, standing near the door as if he was between appointments rather than visiting his mother. I watched him carefully while he spoke about work, about Emily's plans, about how busy the holidays had become, and I realized I was no longer filling in the emotional pauses the way I used to. I was no longer trying to make the conversation feel warmer or easier. I was simply listening. And in that listening, I began to hear what had always been there but never fully acknowledged, that I was not being consulted, I was being informed, not included in decisions, but updated after they were made. After he left, I stood in the doorway for a long time, holding the small gift he had given me, and I did not open it, not because I was ungrateful, but because I understood gifts can sometimes be gestures that replace presence rather than express it. The next day, I drove to the grocery store to pick up a few things I did not need, just to leave the house, and while standing in the aisle comparing nothing in particular, I noticed another woman around my age speaking to her daughter on the phone, laughing softly about holiday plans. And I felt an unexpected wave of clarity watching her, not envy exactly, but recognition of something I had stopped questioning in my own life, the assumption of inclusion, the ease of being asked, the naturalness of being considered. I returned home and placed the groceries on the counter without urgency, then sat at the kitchen table and opened my laptop for the first time in weeks with intention. I searched through family emails, past invitations, old messages, not looking for anything Specific at first, but patterns began to emerge as I went back further. Repeated phrasing, consistent omissions, decisions made and communicated after the fact. And I saw clearly now that what had once felt like occasional oversight was actually a consistent structure, one I had been participating in without resistance for years. And yet the strange part was that no one had ever been cruel in an obvious way. There were no harsh words, no direct rejections, only a steady redistribution of attention that had gradually moved me away from the center without ever announcing it. Later that evening, Jason texted again asking if I needed anything for New Year's Eve, wine, dessert, anything specific. And I stared at the message for a long time before replying, not because I was upset, but because I was finally aware that every small exchange carried more meaning than I had previously allowed myself to see. I responded that I was fine, and that I would let him know about dinner soon, and after sending it I felt something unfamiliar settle inside me, not anger, not sadness, but a kind of internal alignment, as if I had finally stopped moving automatically in response to others and started observing the shape of my own choices. I looked around my quiet kitchen, at the chair where I had sat through so many years of meals and conversations, and I realized that nothing in the room had changed, but my perception of it had, because I was no longer only the person who prepared everything for others, I was also the person deciding what came next, and as the evening light faded through the window, I understood that the coming new year was no longer just about attending another dinner. It was about whether I would continue accepting a role I had never consciously agreed to play, or whether I would finally step into a space where my presence was not assumed, but recognized. I did not notice the exact moment things shifted again, not at first. Because change in families, like mine, rarely announces itself loudly. It arrives instead in small decisions that feel reasonable in isolation, but together create a distance you can no longer ignore. It began with a simple message from Emily 2 days before New Year's Eve, confirming final arrangements, reminding everyone to arrive by 6:30 in the evening, and listing what each person would bring. I read it carefully more than once, not because I was confused, but because I was paying attention in a way I had not done before. I noticed how naturally the message assumed agreement, how effortlessly it assigned roles without asking if those roles were acceptable. I was included in the list for dessert, nothing more, nothing less. As if contribution was now the only measure of belonging, I sat with that message for a long time before responding, and when I did, I simply said I would bring something simple, nothing elaborate. And Emily replied with a small heart emoji that felt polite but distant. That afternoon I found myself cleaning my house again, even though it was already in order, not because I needed cleanliness, but because movement kept my thoughts from settling too deeply in one place. I dusted shelves I had already dusted earlier that week. I folded blankets that were already folded, and I realized I was performing routine as a way to avoid the weight of anticipation, because something about the approaching dinner no longer felt like a celebration. It felt like a test whose rules I had not been given. Later Jason called briefly, his voice carrying the same easy tone he used when discussing schedules and meetings, and he told me Emily was excited for everyone to be together, and that it would be a smaller, more organized evening this year. I listened and asked a simple question, who exactly would be there, and there was a pause before he answered, listing names in a way that sounded rehearsed, and when he finished, I noticed what was missing without him needing to say it. I was not excluded explicitly, but I was also not anchored anywhere within what he described. I thanked him for the information and ended the call sooner than I normally would. Then I sat alone at my kitchen table for a long time, watching the late afternoon light move across the floor, thinking about how easily someone can remain inside a story while slowly being written out of its center. The next day I went to the grocery store again, this time with a list I barely followed, picking up items I did not strictly need, moving slowly through aisles as if time itself had softened, and I noticed how ordinary everything looked around me. Families preparing for holidays, people choosing food and decorations, laughing over small decisions, and I realized that my life still looked exactly the same from the outside, yet internally something had begun to reorganize itself, not in chaos, but in clarity. When I returned home I placed the groceries away carefully, then stood in front of the mirror in my hallway for a long moment, studying my reflection not with judgment, but with recognition. I saw a woman who had spent a long time making herself small in order to keep things smooth. And I wondered when that habit had become invisible even to myself. That evening I received another message from Emily, confirming seating arrangements for New Year's Eve dinner, and this time I noticed something I had missed before. My name was placed at the far end of the table, separated slightly from the main group, positioned in a way that suggested inclusion without closeness. I stared at the message longer than I intended, not because I was offended in the emotional sense, but because I was finally seeing the structure behind the comfort, and I realized that no one had asked me where I would prefer to sit, because the question itself had never been part of the conversation. Later, Jason stopped by briefly again, bringing something forgotten from the previous visit, and he stood in my doorway speaking about traffic and work and how busy everything had become, and I watched him carefully as he avoided certain pauses in conversation, filling silence quickly as if silence itself might reveal something unintended, and I understood that he was not trying to hurt me, but he was also not noticing me in the way he used to, and that difference, subtle as it was, felt larger than any argument could have been. After he left, I did not immediately sit down. I remained standing in the quiet hallway listening to the sound of the door settling back into place, and I thought about how often I had mistaken proximity for connection, how often I had believed that being near people meant being included by them, but now I was beginning to understand that inclusion is not about presence, it is about recognition, and recognition requires intention, not assumption. The following morning I decided to do something I had avoided for a long time. I reviewed all the holiday plans again from the beginning, not emotionally, but practically, as if I were reading a schedule for someone else, and I wrote down each event, each invitation, each message, and what I noticed was no longer subtle, it was consistent, a pattern of decisions made around me rather than with me, and as I finished writing, I placed the paper on the table and simply looked at it, not with shock, but with acceptance, because something in me had already crossed a threshold where denial was no longer possible, and in that quiet kitchen, surrounded by the ordinary sounds of a winter morning, I realized that the approaching New Year dinner was no longer just another family gathering. It had become a moment of decision, not for them, but for me, because I could no longer unsee what I had finally understood. That I had been living inside a version of family that functioned smoothly without requiring my full presence, and now the only question left was not whether I would attend, but whether attending would still mean the same thing it had always meant before. I did not realize how quiet a house could feel until I stopped trying to fill it with activity, because once I accepted that I was not being included in the way I used to be, the silence around me changed shape. It was no longer uncomfortable in the same way. It became something more observational. Like I was finally hearing what had always been there beneath all the noise of routine. The morning before New Year's Eve, I woke up earlier than usual without an alarm, and instead of reaching for messages or checking notifications, I sat by the kitchen window and watched the sky slowly shift from gray to a pale winter blue. I made coffee but left it untouched for a while, simply holding the warm cup in my hands as if grounding myself in something physical while my thoughts settled into clarity. I had received no additional messages overnight from Jason or Emily, and that absence itself now felt meaningful, not painful, just informative, like a space that had been left intentionally open without explanation. Later that morning, I began preparing for the evening in a way that surprised even me, not by rushing or overthinking, but by doing only what felt necessary. I chose a simple dish to bring, something modest and familiar, not because I was withdrawing, but because I was no longer performing. I realized I had spent years preparing not just food for family gatherings, but emotional atmosphere, adjusting myself constantly to maintain harmony. And now I was no longer interested in maintaining something that required my invisibility to function. As the day progressed, I found myself moving through my home with unusual calm, organizing nothing in particular, simply existing within it. And I noticed how many small traces of my life were embedded in every corner. Photographs on shelves, Handwritten notes in drawers, the quiet accumulation of decades spent building a home I had always assumed would naturally include me within its center. In the late afternoon, Jason called again. His tone slightly more hurried than usual, asking if I was still coming that evening, and I could hear background noise on his end, the sound of movement, voices, preparations already underway. I told him I would be there. And there was a brief pause before he responded, as if confirming something internally. Then he said, "Good, Emily will be glad," and the way he said it made it clear that the evening had already been mentally finalized without me. I hung up and stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at the clock, realizing that nothing about the upcoming dinner required urgency from anyone except me, and even that urgency was optional now. When evening finally came, I did not rush. I dressed simply, not out of resignation, but out of neutrality. And as I looked at myself in the mirror, I noticed something different in my expression. Not sadness, not anger, but a kind of stillness that comes after long internal negotiation ends. I drove to Emily's sister's house just as the sky was darkening, the streets lit with early winter lights and scattered decorations from neighboring homes. And as I approached the address, I could already see cars parked outside, warm light spilling through large windows. Movement inside suggesting a gathering already in motion. I sat in my car for a moment before entering, not hesitating out of fear, but observing my own readiness, because for the first time I was not walking into a space hoping to be included. I was walking into a space already aware of how inclusion was being defined without me. When I finally stepped out and walked toward the house, I noticed how easily the sound of laughter carried through the door, how naturally the evening continued without pause. And I understood that my presence would not disrupt anything that had been carefully arranged. Inside, the air was warm, conversations layered over one another, people greeting each other with familiarity that did not require explanation. Jason spotted me and smiled quickly, the kind of smile that acknowledges arrival but does not alter momentum. Emily approached shortly after, polite as always, guiding me gently toward the side of the room where appetizers were arranged, and I followed without resistance. Not because I was submissive, but because I was now watching everything as it was, not as I wished it to be. I placed my dish on the table among others that had already been labeled and arranged, and I noticed how seamlessly mine blended into the background of contributions, not highlighted, not centered, simply present. I stood there for a moment observing the room, noticing how groups naturally formed around conversation patterns that did not include me. How seating had already been determined through unspoken understanding, and I realized something important, that no one was actively trying to exclude me in this moment, because exclusion had already been completed long before I arrived. It existed in structure, not in action. Later, Jason came over briefly, asking if I was comfortable, his tone polite but distracted, and I said yes, I was fine, and I meant it in a way I had not meant many things before, because comfort was no longer dependent on placement or recognition. It was dependent on awareness, and I was becoming more aware than I had ever been. Emily passed by shortly after, coordinating something across the room, and she smiled at me the same way one might smile at a guest who has arrived as expected, not as essential, and I returned the smile without effort, not because I was agreeing with the role assigned to me, but because I was no longer resisting the observation of it. As the evening continued, I found myself standing slightly apart from the main gathering, not isolated, just positioned differently, and from that distance I could see the full structure of the night more clearly than I ever had before, how easily conversations flowed without needing me to anchor them, how naturally decisions had already been made, how smoothly the world of this family operated without interruption, and instead of feeling erased, I felt something closer to understanding, because for the first time I was not inside the system trying to find my place. I was outside it observing its design, and as I looked across the room at Jason speaking with Emily, I realized that the question I had carried for so long was no longer about why I was not included, but about what it meant that I had continued to expect inclusion in a space that had already learned to function without asking for my participation. And in that realization there was no collapse, only clarity. Because now I understood that the story I had been living in was not ending, It was simply revealing itself for what it had become. I did not immediately notice how much distance could exist inside a single room full of people, because at first glance everything looked warm, familiar, even celebratory. The kind of New Year gathering that should have felt like continuity, like belonging. Yet as I stood quietly near the edge of the living room holding my small dish in my hands, I realized I was observing something different. I was watching a structure that functioned perfectly without requiring my participation in its center. Conversations flowed naturally in circles that did not need to expand outward. Laughter rose and fell in patterns that did not pause for acknowledgement, and I found myself no longer trying to enter them, only studying them. Jason was across the room speaking with a group of relatives, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested comfort in a system he understood completely. Emily moved between guests with quiet efficiency, adjusting details of the evening in subtle ways that no one seemed to question, and I noticed how often her decisions became invisible because they were accepted before they were recognized as decisions at all. I placed my dish on the table among others and stepped back slightly, not because I was withdrawing emotionally, but because I was beginning to understand positioning in a new way. I was no longer searching for a place within the gathering. I was observing how places were assigned, and who was responsible for that assignment. At one point, Jason approached me briefly, asking if I had everything I needed, his tone polite and casual, and I answered that I did, and there was no further exchange, no additional curiosity, no sense that anything needed to be adjusted, and I realized that this was not neglect in the dramatic sense people often imagine. It was something more structural. A default setting that no longer included adjustment for my presence. Emily passed by later and smiled at me in a way that was warm but brief, the kind of smile given when everything is already in order and nothing requires revision. And I returned it without hesitation, not because I was trying to match her, but because I had stopped interpreting every gesture as a request to be included. I simply allowed it to be what it was. As the evening continued, I moved slightly to the side of the room, near a window where the glass reflected faint outlines of the gathering behind me, and from that position I could see everything more clearly than I had when I was trying to be part of it. I saw how naturally people formed groups based on familiarity that did not require explanation, how conversations continued seamlessly when certain individuals were absent from them, how attention shifted without disruption, and I began to understand that what I had once interpreted as being overlooked was actually something more consistent, a long gradual repositioning that had happened without conflict, without confrontation, without announcement. I thought about earlier years when I would have been at the center of arranging such evenings, when I would have been the one ensuring everyone was comfortable, when I would have noticed immediately if someone stood alone near a wall, and I realized that role had not been taken from me in a single moment. It had been absorbed slowly into other people's routines until it no longer required my involvement. Jason eventually came back to where I was standing and spoke briefly about plans for the coming months, mentioning work, travel, and Emily's scheduling priorities. And I listened without interrupting, noticing how easily future plans were being constructed without reference points that included me. And when he finished speaking, there was a short silence, not uncomfortable, just complete, as if everything necessary had already been said. I nodded and told him it sounded busy, and he smiled in agreement before returning to the room, and I remained where I was, not because I felt pushed away, but because I no longer felt compelled to move closer. And in that stillness, I began to see the difference between being present and being integrated, between occupying space and being accounted for within it. Later in the evening, I walked slowly through the room once more, observing interactions not as a participant, but as someone reading a pattern, and I noticed something I had not allowed myself to see before, that no single person was responsible for my distance. There was no moment of decision, no clear act of exclusion, only a collective adjustment that had become so normalized it no longer required awareness. And as I stood there, holding that realization without resistance, I understood that the story I had been trying to interpret as personal rejection was actually something more systemic, a quiet evolution of roles that I had not adapted to because I had not been told adaptation was necessary. And now, In the middle of a room filled with people who continued their evening without interruption, I felt an unexpected sense of clarity rather than confusion, because for the first time I was no longer asking where I belonged within the moment. I was recognizing that the moment itself no longer required me to define my belonging at all. I stayed near the window longer than I expected, not because I was avoiding the room behind me, but because I was finally able to observe it without needing to belong inside it. The noise of conversation continued in steady waves, rising and falling like something rehearsed through familiarity rather than coordination, and I noticed how easily I could separate myself from it without anyone realizing I had done so. Jason passed by once, then twice, each time moving with the same ease he had when he was younger. Except now his attention never lingered long enough to settle anywhere outside his immediate circle, and Emily continued to move through the gathering with quiet precision, never rushing, never hesitating, always slightly ahead of any request that might have existed. I realized I had stopped tracking whether I was included in their movements, and instead began noticing how naturally their world functioned without requiring my interpretation. At some point, I found myself sitting in a chair near the edge of the room. Not because I had been directed there, but because I had chosen not to follow the flow of people anymore, and that choice felt different from exclusion. It felt like observation. Jason eventually approached again, this time sitting briefly across from me, asking if I was feeling warm enough, if I needed anything from the kitchen, and I answered simply that I was fine, and there was no urgency in my voice, no expectation behind my words. And I noticed how quickly the conversation ended after that, not out of discomfort, but because there was nothing further required from either side. Emily glanced over once during a passing moment and gave a polite acknowledgement, the kind of acknowledgement that completes a social loop without opening a new one, and I returned it calmly, without searching for additional meaning, because I was beginning to understand that meaning was something I had been assigning rather than receiving. As the evening continued, I found myself thinking less about being excluded and more about how long I had been participating in a system that did not require me to question its structure. I remembered earlier years when I would anticipate every detail of gatherings like this, when I would mentally prepare for everyone's comfort, when I would measure success by how smoothly others experienced the moment. And I realized that in doing so I had also trained myself to accept a role where my presence was defined only by utility, not by recognition. The realization did not arrive as emotion but as sequence, one thought leading to another without interruption, until the pattern became visible enough that it no longer required interpretation. I stood up at one point and walked slowly through the room again, not to join anyone, but to observe how naturally people adjusted their positions when someone new entered their space, how conversations were formed without pause, how attention redistributed itself with almost invisible efficiency, and I understood that what I had once interpreted as distance was actually continuity, a system that maintained itself without needing to account for every individual equally at all times. Jason's voice carried briefly across the room as he spoke with someone near the fireplace, and I noticed how easily he shifted between conversations without ever needing to anchor himself to one location. Emily stood near the dining table speaking softly to another guest, her posture relaxed, her attention divided but controlled, and I realized that she was not creating exclusion in any deliberate way. She was simply operating within a structure where inclusion was no longer automatically extended in my direction. Later I returned to the chair near the window, and from there I could see reflections of both inside and outside the house at once, the warm interior filled with movement and light, and the dark winter night beyond the glass where everything was still and silent, and I found myself thinking about how I had spent so many years believing that belonging was something maintained through effort, through participation, through consistency, but what I was seeing now was that belonging had also become something distributed, negotiated silently between others, without requiring my input, and as I sat there I felt an unfamiliar steadiness forming, not a reaction, not resistance, but recognition. Because I was no longer trying to adjust myself to fit into the room, I was finally seeing the room as it existed independently of me, and that separation did not feel like loss anymore, it felt like clarity. Jason eventually came over one last time before the evening began to wind down, asking if I was ready to leave soon, and I said I would when the time felt right, and he nodded without question, accepting the answer as complete, and as he walked away I remained seated, not waiting for permission, not waiting for invitation. Simply remaining until I decided otherwise, and in that moment I understood something I had not understood before, that the absence I had been feeling was not something happening to me in real time, it was something I had only recently become able to see, and now that I could see it, I could also see that I was no longer inside it in the same way I had been before, and that realization did not close anything, it opened everything.